If you drive north from Yellowstone's northern entrance and follow the Yellowstone River as it carves its way through sagebrush valleys, you'll eventually come to a small clapboard house on the edge of Livingston, Montana. This is where Margaret Cole, 61 years old, lives out her quiet days. She's a retired librarian, the widow of a park ranger who once knew every trail in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness by heart. Now the ranger's boots sit untouched by the door-cracked leather, holding a story Margaret still cannot bring herself to tell. Her house isn't grand. The paint peels on the shutters. The garden, once bright with tomatoes and sunflowers, has gone wild. Chickens no longer scratch in the yard. The greenhouse glass cracked last winter under the weight of heavy snow, and she hasn't found the energy to repair it. But inside, every shelf is lined with books, field guides, old wildlife documentaries on DVD. Her husband's journals filled with neat handwriting that smelled faintly of pine and coffee when she first opened them after his death. Grief leaves its fingerprints everywhere. Margaret wakes in silence most mornings. The kettle takes longer to whistle than it used to, or maybe it just feels that way because no one is there to pour the second cup. Her evenings are marked by the sound of the wind pressing against the windows, coyotes crying in the distance, and the hollow creak of the porch swing when no one is sitting on it. Yellowstone Valley is vast, but loneliness has a way of making even open landscapes feel like closed rooms. Yet, she stays. She stays because she believes the land remembers. She stays because her husband used to say, "This valley holds more stories than any library, Maggie. All you have to do is listen." And so she listens. She listens to elk bugles in autumn, the drumming of grouse in spring, the long hush of snowfall blanketing the valley in winter. What Margaret doesn't tell most people is that she has become a quiet caretaker of more than memories. She volunteers with a small wildlife rescue program in town. It isn't glamorous work. Sometimes she drives injured owls to the nearest vet. Sometimes she nurses raccoons until they're strong enough to return to the forest. Sometimes, when the shelters are full, she opens her porch to temporary guests, an orphaned fox kit, a fawn with a broken leg, even a porcupine once who ate half her pumpkin supply before waddling back into the timber. This part of Montana is no stranger to wild animals. Grizzly bears, black bears, elk, wolves, and mountain lions all move through these valleys. For most people, that knowledge brings a thrill and a fear. For Margaret, it brings responsibility. She's not naive. She knows grizzly bears are often painted as wild killers, the embodiment of untamed danger. She's seen the headlines, the campfire stories, the myths that spread faster than facts. But she's also read the science, how grizzlies are keystone species, shaping forests and meadows by turning soil, scattering seeds, and controlling ungulate numbers. Without them, Yellowstone would not be Yellowstone. That duality has always fascinated her. People label wild animals as either monsters or mascots, dangerous predators, or cute symbols on posters. Margaret knows neither is the full truth. She once explained it to a neighbor this way: wild animals don't fit neatly into our boxes. They don't care what we call them. They just are. And our job is to learn how to live alongside that. One example she often thinks about happened the year after her husband died. She was driving home late from the library when her headlights swept across a black bear crossing the road. A cub followed behind, unsteady but determined. Margaret slowed, rolled down her window just enough to hear their huffs in the night air, and something stirred in her. They were not tame. They were not meant for her. But their presence reminded her that life carries on with or without our permission. That small lesson, life continuing, regardless, settled into her bones, like a quiet truth she could hold on to when everything else felt empty. Still, healing has been slow. Margaret spends her afternoons knitting, reading, and writing small notes in her journal. Some entries are mundane weather reports, the first robin of spring, the date of the last frost. Others are confessions. She never voices aloud. "I don't know who I am without him. I'm afraid if I stop caring for animals, I'll stop caring for myself." It's not that she set out to be strong. It's simply that being useful even in small ways keeps her tethered to the world. When she places a healed hawk back into the sky and watches it soar toward the mountains, she feels for a brief moment that she belongs again. When she sees a raccoon sprint back into the cottonwoods, She hears her husband's voice whisper, "Good job, Maggie." And yet, even as the valley holds her, she feels the edges of her life shrinking. Her days follow the same rhythm. Her nights are long. She avoids town events because pity in neighbors' eyes is harder to bear than solitude. She tells herself that caring for small, injured animals is enough, but part of her wonders if she has already stopped expecting anything new to arrive. But life rarely waits for us to be ready. It intrudes when it chooses, often with a phone call at the exact moment you've convinced yourself you're fine. For Margaret, that call came one late September morning as fog drifted low over the valley floor. She was sipping tea from a chipped mug, the same mug her husband used every morning before heading out on patrol. The phone rang, and she almost didn't answer. But she did. And on the other end was the local wildlife center. A voice explained that a grizzly cub had been found alone near a logging site. 4 months old, underweight, no mother in sight. The center was full. Staff were overwhelmed. They needed someone calm, someone experienced, someone willing to open a home even just temporarily. Margaret's heart tightened. She had taken in owls, foxes, even porcupines, but never a grizzly bear. The rules for wild animals like that were clear distance, no bonding, no second chances if mistakes were made. And yet the request hung in the air like the weight of the valley itself. She looked at her husband's boots by the door, then at the garden gone to seed. She thought of the black bear and cub she once watched cross the road, moving forward without asking permission, and something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was about to be asked to do more than survive. That call marked the end of quiet, predictable days. It would bring her face to face with a creature most people fear, and yet for Margaret, he would become something entirely different. The cub's name was Coda, and his arrival would test every rule she thought she understood. The story of Margaret's life in Yellowstone Valley is more than the backdrop. It's the soil from which the next chapter grows. A quiet home, a widow's solitude, and a long valley filled with memory were about to meet one trembling heartbeat in a cardboard crate. The next 24 hours would matter more than any in her life because the survival of a tiny grizzly cub depended on them. The truck from the wildlife center arrived late in the afternoon, gravel crunching under its tires as it pulled up to Margaret's small house at the edge of Yellowstone Valley. The door opened and 2 volunteers lifted out a plain cardboard crate with ventilation holes cut into its sides. No fancy markings, no warning labels, just a box taped shut carrying a heartbeat. Inside was a grizzly bear cub, maybe 4 months old, weighing less than he should have. His fur was patchy in places, his ribs faintly visible beneath the scruff. The wildlife officer who handed Margaret the paperwork said only, "Mother presumed dead. Found near a logging site. We can't keep him here. You're the only option for stabilization." Then he tipped his cap and drove away, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. She placed the box gently in her sunroom, the same space where she had once fostered owls and raccoons. She knelt beside it, her breath slow, hands steady, though her chest felt tight. When she opened the flaps, 2 amber eyes blinked back at her, wide, unblinking, both wary and oddly calm. The cub made no sound, no cry, no growl, just stared as if waiting for Margaret to remember something she didn't know she had forgotten. Margaret whispered, "All right, little one. Let's see what we can do." For wildlife rehabilitation, the first 24 hours are everything. They determine not just survival, but trust. Margaret had gone through it dozens of times with birds, foxes, and even porcupines. But a grizzly cub was another world entirely. She opened her battered notebook, flipping to the first 24-hour checklist she had copied from a wildlife manual years ago. On screen, the steps would be simple, almost clinical. Weight. Establish baseline note undernourishment. Hydration pinch test. Gently check the elasticity of the skin. Fecal check. Signs of parasites, stress, diarrhea. Warming protocol. Heating pads under straw, never direct contact. Formula ratio. Carnivore milk replacer, precise dilution. Quiet hours. Limit noise, minimal handling, low light. Margaret read each line aloud as if reciting a prayer. Then she set to work. She slipped on gloves, lifted the cub gently from the crate, and placed him on the scale she had borrowed from the center. 22 pounds, too light for his age. She pinched the scruff of his neck. The skin held slow to return. Dehydrated. She noted it. She unwrapped a small towel, warmed it in the dryer, and set it in the straw-lined crate. She mixed the formula, careful to follow the exact dilution, and filled a syringe. When she brought the tip to his mouth, he resisted at first, turning his head. Then cautiously he latched, drinking in small pulls. Margaret steadied him with one hand, keeping her voice quiet, neutral. No names, no soothing tones, just presence. The cub finished half the syringe, then rested his head against the towel. Margaret wrote the time in her notebook, marked the intake complete. She thought of her husband, then how he used to say, "These animals don't owe us trust, but if they give us a little, we'd better be worthy of it." In those first hours, Margaret noticed something unusual. Most wild cubs cry when separated, paw frantically at the crate or hide in corners. This one did none of that. He simply watched. His eyes tracked her every movement, not panicked, not pleading, just still as if measuring her. It reminded Margaret of a night years earlier when her husband had taken her into the back country to watch grizzlies forage for berries. They stayed at a safe distance, binoculars in hand. She had expected aggression, chaos. Instead, she saw patience. The bears moved deliberately, each action measured, every choice purposeful. The small lesson she took away, then returned, now wild doesn't mean reckless. Wild often means observant, intentional. And perhaps this cub carried that same lesson, offering it back to her in his quiet, steady gaze. Margaret set alarms every 3 hours. Each time she slipped on gloves, entered the sunroom, and repeated the ritual, feed clean record. The cub accepted the formula more easily with each session. At midnight, his paws twitched as if dreaming. At 3 a.m., he lifted his head when she entered, then lowered it again, content. By dawn, she felt the rhythm between them, clinical, yes, but carrying an undercurrent of something harder to name. Fatigue pressed against her, but so did a flicker of peace. Caring for something so fragile had pulled her back into motion. Busy hands, she reminded herself, keep the heart from falling apart. Still, she knew the rules. No bonding, no names, no softness. She repeated the mantra silently as she cleaned the syringe. Temporary, temporary, temporary. By the end of the first 24 hours, Margaret had learned 2 things. First, the cub was stronger than he looked. He drank steadily, his breathing stable, no signs of infection or injury beyond dehydration and hunger. Second, he was watching her. Always. It unsettled her, but it also forced a perspective shift. She had always thought rehabilitation was about what she could give, food safety medicine. But perhaps with this cub it might also be about what she was willing to receive, to be seen in her rawness, her loneliness by something wild. That was new, that was dangerous. She closed her notebook and whispered again to the empty room, "This is temporary." Yet her hand lingered a moment longer on the crate than it should have. The first day with any wild animal, especially one as misunderstood as a grizzly bear, teaches something most people overlook. Survival is not dramatic. It's not a roaring battle. It's a careful measurement. Ounces gained, hours of rest, quiet, repeated actions. We want to believe that strength is about power, but more often it's about patience. Margaret's careful notes, the soft towel, the measured formula. All of it said more about survival than claws or teeth ever could. And in that patience lay a truth we can hold for ourselves. Healing rarely comes in leaps. It comes in increments, almost invisible, until one day you look back and realize the world has shifted. When Margaret closed her eyes that night, she thought she had managed to hold the line. She told herself the cub was stable, that her work was purely clinical. But she didn't yet realize how much those wide amber eyes had already rearranged the walls she built around her grief. In the next days, the cub would reach toward her, not with claws, but with presence. And Margaret, against every rule she had once sworn to follow, would feel herself reaching back. The second day began the way the first had ended, with Margaret telling herself the same word again and again. Temporary. She wore gloves, avoided eye contact, and spoke only when necessary. The wildlife center had been clear, with a grizzly bear cub boundaries are the only protection for both animal and human. If you want to keep wildness alive, you keep a distance. But distance has a way of collapsing when a creature refuses to play by the manual. That morning, Margaret entered the sunroom with the formula prepared, careful to move without noise. She expected the cub to stay curled in the straw, still weak from dehydration. Instead, he stood as she stepped in, wobbling but determined. His eyes followed her from the door to the crate, not with aggression, not even with curiosity, just with a steady focus that made her pause. She knelt and offered the syringe. He drank paws, resting against the towel. And then almost casually, one paw slid forward until it touched her knee. She froze. The paw was small, soft-furred, but heavy enough to remind her of what it would one day become. Claws sheathed no threat. Just contact, Margaret whispered. That's not in the book. Wildlife manuals describe protocols, how to feed, how to weigh, how to prevent imprinting. They list danger signs, growling, pawing, or refusal of food. But they rarely describe what happens when an animal chooses presence over fear. Margaret had raised birds that shrieked until they flew again. She had seen raccoons cower until the door opened to the forest, but she had never felt this kind of deliberate stillness. The cub was not reaching for food. He was not climbing. He was simply anchoring himself against her. It reminded her of a story her husband once told about a ranger in Glacier National Park. The man had stood still for hours as a black bear grazed nearby. Patience, her husband had said, is its own kind of conversation. Sometimes the wild isn't speaking in roars. It's speaking in silences. Margaret felt that silence now heavy as the mountains outside. Unsure, she called an old acquaintance doctor, Daniel Everett, a behavioral ecologist from Bozeman who had studied large carnivores across the Rockies. She explained the cub's behavior, how he didn't flinch, how he pressed close. On the line, Daniel paused. Then he said, "It's rare, but not impossible. Sometimes, especially when cubs lose their mothers very young, they display what we call selective social bonding. It isn't domestication, it's an attachment, one that reflects both need and choice." Margaret asked, "Does it fade?" "Usually," Daniel said, "but sometimes it deepens. That's when things get complicated." The call ended, but the words stayed. Complicated. Not wrong, not right. Just complicated. That afternoon, Margaret logged the cub's weight, 23 pounds, a slight gain. She noted food intake, hydration, and sleep cycles. Her handwriting was steady, but her thoughts scattered. She remembered the feel of the paw against her knee. She remembered how the cub had not looked at her as if she were a threat, but as if she were a fixture in his small, fragile world. Later that evening, she sat on the porch, journal in hand. She wrote, "He doesn't cry, he doesn't hide. He just watches. His eyes don't accuse, they ask." And with that line, she realized she was no longer writing about protocols. She was writing about presence. In caring for animals, Margaret had always believed the rule was to give without receiving. Feed, heal, release. But the cub was teaching her something different, that sometimes healing is not a one-way exchange. Sometimes it is mutual. Bonding is not always a breach of rules. It can be a bridge between wounds. For the cub, the wound was the loss of his mother. For Margaret, the wound was the absence of her husband. In that silent room, they were each filling spaces neither had chosen to carry. Many see grizzly bears only as wild killers, symbols of power and danger. They picture claws, teeth, and headlines. But Margaret was beginning to see something else, the way a cub, barely steady on his paws, could carry gentleness as deliberate as any human embrace. The fresh perspective came like a whisper. Wildness is not the opposite of tenderness. It can hold both. She thought of the people who feared the bears outside Yellowstone's borders, people who locked up trash cans and carried bear spray with trembling hands. She did not dismiss their fear. It was valid, but she also knew fear was only part of the truth. The other part was here in her sunroom with a cub who looked at her as if she were more than a feeder, more than a figure moving in and out. And perhaps that was the risk. Once you see both sides, you cannot return to simple labels. By the end of the third night, Margaret abandoned the gloves. She told herself it was only because the cub's muzzle was beginning to chafe that she needed to feel his warmth to judge hydration properly. But she knew better. She wanted to feel the heartbeat under her hands. She whispered once without meaning to, "You're not like the others, are you?" The cub blinked slow and soft as if to say, "Neither are you." She closed her notebook and leaned back, the hum of his small breath steady in the straw. For the first time in years, she felt the weight in her chest lift just slightly, like snow melting off a roof. The first signs of bonding are often subtle. A paw on a knee, a gaze that lingers too long. These are easy to dismiss, but they carry weight. They remind us that connection does not need words, and that even across species, recognition is possible. For viewers, the takeaway is not that every wild animal seeks closeness, most do not. The takeaway is that when it does happen, it challenges our assumptions. It asks us to reconsider the sharp lines we draw between human and wild. It asks whether healing is less about keeping boundaries and more about honoring the moments when those boundaries bend. Margaret told herself she would hold firm. She doubled down on the protocol's shorter feedings, less speaking, more distance. But the cub had already found his way through. Soon the rules she leaned on for decades would collide head-on with the pull of a bond she could not deny. And when a wildlife officer came to remind her of the risks she would have to face, the hardest truth of all, that her heart had already decided before her mind caught up. For days, Margaret repeated the rules, gloves on, eyes averted, no speaking in tones that carried comfort. She shortened feedings, kept her voice clipped, and forced her body to move like a shadow. But the cub, Coda, was not reading the same manual. Each time she entered the sunroom, his eyes met hers with that same steady patience. Each time she tried to pull back, he found a way forward. The turning point came on a Thursday morning. Margaret was tired. A storm had rattled the windows all night, the kind of wind that bends fence posts and sends shutters slamming against siding. She shuffled into the sunroom, hair undone, hands sore, formula bottle warm in her palm. Coda was already waiting at the door of his crate, not frantic, not loud, just standing as if he had known she would come. She scooped him with the towel, held the bottle. He drank, paws kneading against her flannel sleeve. But before the bottle was empty, he stopped, lifted his head and pressed his front paws firmly against her chest. Then, with a small exhale, he leaned his weight forward until his head rested against her shoulder. Margaret froze. Her breath caught her body rigid. She whispered, "No, you're not supposed to." But the cub stayed. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the soft vibration of a hum. Grizzly cubs don't purr, but they sometimes huff when content a sound deep and steady. It reverberated against her ribs like a drumbeat from another world. She sat motionless, torn between instinct and instruction. Every line in the rulebook had been crossed. And yet in that moment she felt something inside her fracture in a way that was less breaking and more release. Later that week, as she hung laundry on the line, a truck pulled up the gravel drive. Nathaniel Brooks, a state wildlife officer, stepped out. Tall, clipboard in hand, his expression carried the kind of seriousness Margaret had come to expect from officials who lived by statutes and inspection codes. "I heard you've got a cub," he said. "Temporary," Margaret replied. He nodded, but his eyes scanned the property with practiced efficiency. "You know what I have to say, right? If you let him get too attached, or if you do release, won't be possible. You'll be on the hook for a lifetime permit. That means enclosure upgrades, vet records, state inspections, and liability insurance. It's not just care, it's a contract with the law." Margaret stayed silent, folding a towel slowly. Nathaniel's voice softened. "I've seen you work with animals, Margaret. You know the rules as well as I do, but I can see it already. You've made your decision. You just haven't said it out loud yet." He left, leaving behind only the sound of his truck fading down the road. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, paperwork spread out before her. She traced the headings with her finger: application, inspection, enclosure standards. Each line carried weight: minimum square footage, double door entries, climbing structures, veterinary partnerships, cost estimates running into thousands. Timeline 6 months, maybe more. Contacts, Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. She whispered to herself, "Do I even have the strength for this?" Yet even as she asked, she knew the answer. The hug had already changed everything. The next morning, Margaret tried to reset the boundary. She wore gloves again, shortened feeding time, and spoke only in single words. But when she turned to leave, Coda padded forward, pressed his small paw against the mesh, and simply waited. Margaret stood still, caught in the space between law and longing. In that moment, she understood what Nathaniel had meant. The decision had already been made, not in paperwork, but in presence. She was no longer just a caretaker. She was part of the cub's small world. She wrote in her journal that night, "I didn't mean to let him in. But when he leaned on me, I leaned back. Even if only for a moment." Rules are essential. They protect both human and animal, and they define clear lines. But sometimes rules meet reality, and reality is messier. The manuals cannot account for the quiet weight of a paw against your chest or the way grief softens when met by trust. Breaking the rules is not the point. The point is recognizing when love does not fit within the lines we've drawn, and then asking what responsibility comes next. Margaret had always believed in the strict separation of human and wild. Release, not relationship, but the hug forced a fresh perspective. Love does not always diminish wildness, it can illuminate it. What Coda offered was not dependence, but presence. He wasn't seeking to be tamed. He was seeking to be understood. And perhaps Margaret thought that was the real challenge of conservation. Not just to protect animals from extinction, but to protect the rare connections that remind us why their survival matters in the first place. Still, fear tugged at her. What if she had ruined his chance at release? What if every soft word, every hug made him less capable of surviving alone in the Yellowstone wilderness? She pictured her husband boots on, reminding her of the thin line between compassion and caution. She wrote in her journal again, "Would you have let him go, or would you have stayed the way he stayed with me?" No answer came, only the steady hum of Coda asleep in the next room. Practical thoughts pressed in. If she kept him, she would need more than love. She would need double gates, reinforced fencing enrichment structures, a relationship with a licensed vet, and liability coverage in case of escape or injury. It wasn't just a matter of heart. It was infrastructure law and community trust. But even as the list grew longer, Margaret felt her resolve deepen. She had already survived storms of grief. She could survive red tape. From that week on, something shifted. The sunroom, once a sterile place of observation, became a room of communion. Margaret hummed while working, spoke softly to Coda about recipes, weather, and even dreams of her husband. The cub listened, not as a pet, not as a spectacle, but as a presence, a quiet witness. And though she tried to remind herself of the rules, she found herself smiling again. Smiling in a way she hadn't in years. When love collides with rules, most of us default to fear. Fear of consequences, fear of judgment, fear of failure. But love has a way of demanding responsibility rather than retreat. The takeaway here is not to abandon structure, it is to honor it while also acknowledging the rare times life asks us to step beyond. Margaret's choice was not simply to break rules, it was to carry the weight of a bond that demanded more of her than she ever planned to give. And in doing so, she found herself alive again. Yet outside Margaret's sanctuary, a threat was building. Reports began trickling in foxes foaming near the river, raccoons stumbling through town. A virus was spreading swift and unforgiving. And soon Margaret would face the most terrifying thought of all, that even after all she had given, she might still lose the creature who had taught her how to love again. It began with a whisper on the radio. A raccoon had been spotted near the river, stumbling in circles, eyes glazed. The next day, a fox was found by the old sawmill jaw, slack foam on its muzzle. Margaret didn't need more details, she knew the signs. Canine distemper, one of the cruelest viruses in the wild. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, notebook open, pen poised, unable to write. The symptoms ran through her mind like a checklist: fever, runny nose, seizures, paralysis. Death. It spread quickly among raccoons, foxes, skunks, and even big cats. And yes, grizzly bear cubs were not immune. Margaret looked at the sunroom door where Coda lay resting curled in the straw. He seemed healthy, stronger every day. But she also knew vaccines were not perfect. At the Wildlife Center, he had received an initial dose, but boosters take time. Viruses don't wait for timetables. The next morning, Margaret hammered a sign into the gravel road leading up to her property. No visitors until further notice. She sealed compost bins, pulled down bird feeders, and scrubbed the porch with bleach. Every entry point to the sunroom became a boundary. Shoes were changed before entering, gloves washed and dried, hands scrubbed raw. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. Distemper spreads through saliva, urine, feces, sometimes even the air. A single slip could undo everything. Still, the hardest boundary was with people. Ethan, the quiet boy from down the valley who had begun visiting Coda, came by after school. Margaret met him at the gate, her voice low but firm. "Not today, sweetheart. It isn't safe." He nodded once, said nothing, but she saw the way his shoulders sagged. Before leaving, he placed a smooth stone on the fence post, a silent offering. Margaret felt her throat tighten as she watched him walk away. If viewers were watching this story on film, this would be the moment to pause for an explainer. Simple graphics. Calm narration. What is it? Canine distemper is a highly contagious virus affecting carnivores. Vectors spread by direct contact, shared food-contaminated surfaces. Symptoms: eye discharge, coughing, neurological tremors, seizures. Vaccination, initial dose at intake boosters, needed for full protection. Quarantine design. Strict sanitation separation from other wildlife, restricted human access. Hotline Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks for reporting sightings. Knowledge is a form of defense. And Margaret leaned on that knowledge like a lifeline. 10 days into the lockdown, Margaret woke before dawn. The valley was hushed fog pressed low against the fields. She brewed tea, reached for her notebook, and then froze. The sunroom was too quiet. She stepped inside. Coda was not waiting by the mesh the way he always did. He was curled in the far corner, head tucked, sides rising too slowly. Margaret whispered, "Coda." No movement. She unlocked the gate, dropped to her knees in the straw. "Baby, look at me." Her hand hovered above his side, terrified of what she might feel or not feel. Slowly, he stirred, lifted his head, eyes heavy, dull. He exhaled a soft sound somewhere between a sigh and a whimper. Her chest clenched. She thought of the fox by the sawmill, the raccoon by the river. She thought of seizures, of fever, of watching helplessly as a creature slipped away. She pressed her hand to his side, warm but not burning. His heart beat steadily, not racing. His breath as even though slow. Relief trickled through her, fragile but real. Coda shifted, pulled himself unsteadily to his paws and walked toward her. He leaned against her chest, paws resting on her sweater, head pressed to her shoulder. His hum vibrated against her ribs, quieter than usual, but there, still there. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Tears blurred her vision. "You're okay," she whispered, rocking slightly as if soothing a child. "You're staying with me." It wasn't distemper. It was exhaustion. The storm had rattled the valley all night, carrying scents and sounds Coda's instincts couldn't ignore. He had stayed awake, guarding, restless. The wild inside him had kept him on alert while she slept, and now finally his body was claiming rest. The scare taught Margaret something she hadn't expected. Fear isolates, but love endures. In her panic, she realized how much she had already tethered her life to his. Every log in her notebook, every cautious step into the sunroom, every whispered word was not just about keeping him alive, it was about keeping herself alive too. Survival isn't only about health. It's about presence. Sometimes the thing that saves us is not the absence of danger, but the refusal to leave when danger comes. Many people imagine wildlife rehabilitation as a straightforward path. Animal comes in as healed and is released. But distemper reminded Margaret of the truth. The wild doesn't follow straight lines. Viruses sweep through valleys. Laws shape choices. Bonds blur boundaries. Nothing is guaranteed. And yet that uncertainty offered a fresh perspective. It forced her to stop pretending this was temporary, to stop pretending she could detach. She saw clearer than ever that Coda was not just a patient. He was a presence in her life, as steady and necessary as the mountains outside her window. Weeks later, reports confirmed the outbreak had slowed. Carcasses cleared cases fewer. Margaret lifted the lockdown slowly, cautiously. The first person to return was Ethan. He stood at the fence line, hands shoved into his pockets. Margaret opened the gate, halfway nodded. Coda padded forward, pressed his head against the mesh near Ethan's hand. The boy reached out palm to paw, separated by wire, but connected all the same. This time Ethan whispered, "Missed you." Just 2 words, but his voice was clear, steady. Margaret blinked back tears, realizing that even in fear bonds hold. Distemper is merciless. It has taken countless wild animals across North America. But within its threat lies a takeaway for us. Fragility is universal. No matter how strong, how wild, how feared, even a grizzly bear cub can be undone by something invisible. And so can we. What matters is not pretending we are invincible, but building the resilience to face what comes together. The virus passed, but its shadow lingered. Margaret now understood how close she had come to losing Coda, and that realization changed her. Fear gave way to a fiercer kind of resolve. She would not hide him. She would not pretend this bond didn't exist. Soon the valley would learn the truth, not through rumor, but through witness. And the first to see it would be her oldest friend stepping onto her porch with a tin of muffins and a skeptical look. Rumors travel faster than the wind in small valleys. By winter, neighbors whispered about Margaret's unusual guest. Most dismissed it. No one believed a widow at the edge of Yellowstone was raising a grizzly bear cub in her sunroom. But curiosity has its own gravity, and one morning it arrived in the form of an old station wagon pulling into her drive. Clara Jenkins stepped out, denim jacket, buttoned, a tin of muffins in hand. Margaret hadn't seen her in years. They'd taught together once at the local school, Clara math, Margaret library science, before Margaret's life shifted toward grief and solitude. Clara's voice was brisk as ever. "I brought you a blueberry, and I want to see the cub." Margaret sighed, but opened the door. Inside the sunroom, Coda lay sprawled on a log, eyes tracking the stranger immediately. Clara pressed her hands to the glass, squinting. "He's bigger than I thought." Margaret set the muffins down. "He's more than that." When Margaret unlatched the gate, Coda rose, padded forward, and without hesitation stood on his hind legs, resting his front paws lightly against Margaret's side. He pressed his head to her chest, humming low. Clara gasped. "He's hugging you." Margaret only nodded. It's one thing to tell people about a bond. It's another for them to see it. Clara sat at the table afterward, tea cooling in her mug, eyes wide. "I've seen grizzlies in the wild. They don't act like that." "No," Margaret replied quietly. "They don't." The moment hung in the air like a secret too heavy to dismiss. Clara didn't run to spread gossip at the post office. She carried it carefully, like something fragile. And that restraint was its own form of respect. But Margaret knew witnesses required responsibility. She tacked signs by the porch. No touching, no feeding. Staff supervision required. She set a table by the sunroom door stocked with gloves, sanitizer, and masks. She limited visits to brief windows, never more than one person at a time. If this were a film, the screen would flash with a visitor protocol. PSA distance rules are always observed. Protective gear when entering. No hand contact through mesh. No feeding. Staff, or in this case Margaret, present at all times. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a sanctuary. One afternoon, Ethan returned with his grandfather. Margaret allowed it on the condition that they followed every rule. Ethan stood by the mesh, silent, hands in pockets. Coda noticed him, immediately walked forward and lay down close, head resting on his paws. The boy knelt, pulled a smooth stone from his pocket and placed it carefully outside the fence. Coda leaned his head against the mesh beside it. Ethan's eyes softened. For weeks he had said nothing during visits. But that day he whispered 2 words. "Hi, Coda." His grandfather's eyes filled. Margaret looked away, giving the moment privacy. Later, she wrote in her journal, "Some creatures don't rescue, they invite. They make space without demanding. And in that space, healing finds its way." The small lesson is that healing rarely comes from lectures or instructions. It comes from being witnessed without judgment. Ethan didn't need someone to tell him to speak. He needed a presence that said, "You're safe as you are." And Coda, without words, offered exactly that. For Margaret, it was a reminder that the cub was not just transforming her solitude. He was becoming a mirror for others, reflecting their hurt and their hope in ways she could never orchestrate. Many people think wild animals offer danger or entertainment, nothing in between. But Coda offered a fresh perspective. Wildness can also offer witness. His stillness, his patience, his deliberate hum, all of it became a language of trust. Margaret realized something else too. Grief had made her avoid the community. She believed her pain was too heavy to share. But when people came drawn by the rumor of a bear that hugged, they didn't leave with pity. They left with wonder. And in that wonder, Margaret felt less alone. Over the months, a few others came, never by Margaret's invitation, always by quiet request. A young woman battling depression who sat silently on the porch while Coda rested near the mesh. A veteran coping with sleepless nights who found calm just watching the cub breathe. A man newly widowed who stood for 10 minutes without speaking, then left with a steady step he hadn't had before. Margaret allowed these visits rarely carefully. She never advertised, never posed for photos. She reminded each person, "This is not a pet. This is not a show. This is trust given freely, and it demands reverence." Dr. Everett, the ecologist, returned one spring to observe. He scribbled notes, shook his head slowly. "What you have here is unusual. It's not domestication. It's a reciprocal attachment bond. We've seen it in rare cases with orphaned predators, but it rarely endures. The fact that it's lasted this long, it's something worth studying. But more than that, it's something worth respecting." Margaret didn't need science to tell her it was rare. She could feel it every time Coda pressed close, every time his eyes followed her with a steadiness that seemed to see past grief. But hearing it from an expert gave the bond a kind of legitimacy, a shield against those who might call it fantasy. Clara, Ethan, the veteran, the young woman, they all carried their stories quietly into town. Not as gossip, but as whispers of hope. Soon a counselor from the school called Margaret to ask if she might allow carefully screened visits for children struggling with trauma. A local therapist wondered if adults in recovery might find solace in the sanctuary. Margaret hesitated, but she also recognized the loop forming, hurt flowing in, healing flowing out, returning to the valley like water through roots. She kept the circle small, but she no longer kept it closed. When communities hear about wild animals, the story usually ends in conflict, livestock, lost trash, raided, fear heightened. But Margaret's story reminds us of another possibility, wildness as a point of connection. Not to be tamed, not to be exploited, but to be honored. The takeaway is that healing doesn't always come from within 4 walls or clinical settings. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a young grizzly bear cub, pressing his head against the mesh, saying nothing at all. And in that nothingness, creating everything needed. By summer, Margaret realized she could no longer live in secrecy. The bond was out in the open, witnessed it, carried, and respected. And with that realization came responsibility. If Coda were to stay, if the valley was to trust, she would need more than signs and caution tape. She would need permits, enclosures, enrichment, and a sanctuary that met every standard. The decision she had once feared was now her path forward, and it began with a stack of papers and a contractor's first knock on her door. Margaret had once believed her house would always be enough and sunroom, a few crates, shelves lined with books. But by the time spring returned to Yellowstone Valley, it was clear that wasn't true anymore. Coda wasn't a tiny grizzly bear cub curled in a towel. He was growing into his paws, his shoulders widening, his steps heavier. The walls that once contained him now felt like barriers to the life he needed. So Margaret did what she never imagined she would. She filled out the paperwork. The forms arrived thick as a dictionary. Non-releasable wildlife permit application. She read through every section underlining requirements, application, inspection, enclosure standards, double-entry gates, climbing structures, veterinary partnerships, quarterly reports to the Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, cost projections running into thousands. She spread the pages across her kitchen table like puzzle pieces, whispering, "Can I really do this?" But the hug, the gaze, the hum, all the moments that had carried her through grief answered for her. She didn't just want to, she had to. Margaret hired a local contractor who had once raised barns. Together they walked the back acre boots, pressing into thawing ground. "He'll need shade," she said. "Logs to climb, places to scratch." The man raised an eyebrow but nodded. Soon lumber trucks arrived. Post holes were dug. Wire mesh was strung tall and deep, buried beneath the soil to stop any digging. The design became more than a regulation. It became an intention. She insisted on cedar mulch for softness, boulders warmed by the sun for lounging, and a small water feature because, as she told the contractor, he likes the sound. On camera, this could have been shown as an enrichment montage. Coda is sniffing at puzzle feeders hidden with berries, paws pressing along scent trails laid with pine needles, claws scraping down climbing logs, muscles stretched as he leapt from stump to rock. Each shot proves that enrichment isn't a luxury, it's survival. Wild hearts need challenges as much as comfort. The costs piled higher than fence posts. Margaret dipped into her savings, the account she and her husband had once built for retirement trips they never took. She didn't hesitate. Still, she knew the sanctuary couldn't depend on her alone, so she created a small operating snapshot for herself. Annual budget range $15,000 to $20,000. Vet Memorandum of Understanding Dr. Whitaker, large animal specialist in Bozeman. Volunteer roles, cleaning enrichment prep supply runs. Wish list gloves, bleach straw bales, enrichment toys, non-monetary support, carpentry help transport for injured wildlife. Writing it down didn't just organize it, legitimized. It was no longer a hidden bond. It was a structure the community could respect. When the enclosure was finished, Margaret invited two people she trusted to see it first. Dr. Everett, the ecologist, stood with his clipboard nodding. It meets standards. More than that, it meets spirit. Beside him, a rehab advocate named Laura shook her head gently. "You know, Margaret, every time we keep an animal, we remove one more from the wild. It should never be easy." Margaret agreed. "It isn't." Laura softened. "But sometimes the exceptions teach us why the rules matter, and why rarely breaking them matters too. Two voices, two truths, not contradictions but balance." Margaret carried both in her chest. The first day Coda stepped into the new enclosure, Margaret held her breath. He sniffed the air, padded forward, then broke into a clumsy gallop. He climbed a log, leapt to a platform, and shook his head like a pup discovering his legs. Then he plunged into the shallow water pool, splashing like a child. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her. It felt like the valley itself had exhaled. She jotted in her journal, "He is not caged, he is expanded. This space is not a prison, it is a promise." The small lesson is that love without structure is fragile. Margaret's bond with Coda had carried them this far, but it was the sanctuary, the posts, the gates, the enrichment that gave love the chance to last. Rules weren't the enemy. When shaped with care, they became scaffolding for something bigger than either of them could hold alone. Most people think of sanctuaries as places for animals alone. But Margaret discovered they are also sanctuaries for people. Each board nailed, each gate latched, each puzzle feeder filled these actions, gave her a rhythm, a sense of future. Building the sanctuary built her too. And when visitors came, a school counselor, a widower, a veteran, they didn't just see a bear behind a fence. They saw what happens when responsibility and compassion meet. They saw a community learning to coexist with wildness, not erase it. To protect that trust, Margaret started keeping more than journals. She created a simple annual report card pinned to her fridge. Animals assisted this year. 7. Released. 5. Non-releasable now in sanctuary. 1 coda. Volunteers active. 3. Community visits approved. 12. It wasn't for recognition. It was for accountability, for the quiet promise that what she was doing was not just for herself. The takeaway is that sanctuary is not walls. It is choices. Every choice Margaret made, from paperwork to puzzle feeders, said, "I see this bond, I honor it, and I will not let it vanish in secrecy." For us, the lesson is clear. Love grows when we give it structure. Healing deepens when we take the risk of making it visible. By the time summer burned gold across the meadows, Coda had grown into a sleek, muscled bear with eyes that still carried gentleness. Margaret sat on her porch one evening listening to his hum echo across the enclosure and realized this was no longer just about survival. It was a legacy. The sanctuary had become a place where grief turned into purpose, where others came not for spectacle but for solace. And as Coda pressed his head once more into her shoulder, Margaret knew the story wasn't ending. It was only the beginning. By late summer, the valley had changed. The snow-melt streams, thinned grasses stood tall and gold, and the sanctuary pulsed with quiet life. Coda was no longer the trembling grizzly bear cub who had arrived in a crate. He was strong, shoulders, wide fur, rich paws, powerful. Yet every evening when Margaret walked to the edge of the enclosure, he still pressed close, resting his head against her side, humming in that low, steady way. It was no longer about rescue. It was about presence. Margaret sometimes sat with an old photo album on her lap, one page filled with pictures of her husband in ranger uniform, the next with journal entries about Coda. 2 parts of her life that at first seemed separate now folded together. She realized the sanctuary was not a replacement for her loss. It was a continuation of love in another form. She whispered once, "You've given me back mornings worth waking for." Visitors noticed too. Ethan, now taller still, came after school. He didn't always bring stones anymore. Sometimes he brought books, sometimes silence. But every time Coda approached him at the fence, the boy's shoulders, once slouched from sorrow, now held steady. One afternoon he turned to Margaret and said, "When he looks at me, it feels like he knows." Margaret only nodded because she knew exactly what he meant. Clara returned often with muffins, laughing now instead of whispering. Even the veteran, who had come restless the first time, found himself at ease, leaning on the fence, listening to Coda breathe. Each encounter became part of the sanctuary's story, a reminder that this place was not built of boards and wire, but of connection. Margaret kept her annual report pinned to the fridge. Animals, aided releases, completed visits approved. Numbers matter. They prove accountability. They show progress. But she also knew the sanctuary's real success couldn't be measured in numbers. It lived in the way Ethan spoke again, in the way a grieving man stood taller, in the way Margaret herself smiled without forcing it. Healing is contagious. When one life steadies, it steadies others. And when wildness offers trust, it can ripple out into a whole community. For those who feared grizzlies only as wild killers, Margaret now had another way to explain. Yes, they are apex predators, powerful, unpredictable in the wild. Yes, you should carry bear spray and Yellowstone store food properly and respect distance. But power does not erase tenderness. Wild animals carry complexity, and in that complexity lies their true value. Protecting grizzlies isn't just about saving a species. It's about protecting the reminders they carry, that strength and gentleness are not opposites. They can live in the same body. Looking back, Margaret realized her life had shifted from surviving to living again. She had once believed grief had ended her story. But Coda had shown her that endings are also thresholds. The fresh perspective she carried now was this sanctuary is not a place. It's a practice. It's the way we choose to create space for tenderness, for wildness for others, and for ourselves. When she walked out at dusk, fireflies rising along the fence line, she didn't just see a bear in an enclosure. She saw a partnership. He had stayed with her when she didn't know how to stay with herself. And she had chosen to stay with him when the rules said she should let go. One evening, Margaret hosted a small group counselors, volunteers, neighbors. They sat in lawn chairs as the sun dipped low. Coda climbed a log, shook his fur, then padded down to press against the mesh where Margaret stood. She laid her hand over his paw. The group fell silent. No one reached for a phone. No one spoke. They simply watched. Later, one man said softly, "I thought I came here to see a bear. I think I came here to see myself." That was the sanctuary's quiet power. It turned observation into reflection. It reminded people that healing is not spectacle. It is a shared presence. For Margaret, the payoff wasn't that she had built a refuge or that she had saved a cub. It was that she had been saved alongside him. She had learned that caring for wild animals isn't just about keeping them alive. It's about allowing them to awaken what we've let go dormant inside ourselves. The cub, who arrived weak and silent, had become a mirror, showing her that even after unbearable loss, she could still love, still trust, still wake each morning with purpose. But the journey wasn't over. Coda was no longer a cub. He was growing into an adult grizzly, his needs expanding with every season. Margaret knew the future carried new challenges. Accreditation for the sanctuary, securing funding, preparing for long-term care, and maybe even training younger rehabbers who could carry the work forward. And as the valley shifted from summer into the first crisp breath of fall, Margaret wondered what happens when the cub you saved grows into a giant. What does legacy look like when wildness stands taller than you? That question would shape the next chapter. As you've listened to Margaret's story, maybe you felt the pull of your own. Maybe you've remembered moments when love and responsibility collided, when fear almost silenced you, when healing showed up in unexpected forms. Ask yourself, what sanctuaries have you built in your life? Where have you made space for trust, for gentleness, for wildness inside your own heart? If this story has touched something in you, take a moment now. Press pause on the noise of the world. And if you want more stories like this, stories that hold knowledge, emotion, and the quiet reminder that even wild animals can carry tenderness, then let us know. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who could use a reminder that healing is possible. Because, in the end, the real sanctuary is not just Margaret's or Coda's. It's the one we create together every time we choose to see the wild, not as something to fear, but as something to honor.